Bienvenidos. This is a podcast that explores Latinx media and culture in its many forms. I am Dr. Rojo Robles.
And I am Dr. Rebecca El Salois. And we are Latinx and Latin American Studies professors at Baruch College in New York City. In this podcast, we will analyze Latinx film, television, literature, art, and cultures.
We will consider how these works are perceived, analyze them, and investigate the real-world reflections and implication of that work on Latinx cultures in the U.S. and beyond.
Welcome to Latinx Visions.
Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides a nuestra temporada número 8.
Yes, welcome to Season 8 of Latinx Visions. Our theme for this semester is Latinx Cultural Politics, and we're going to be bringing you 3 episodes in which we'll be in conversation with academics, visual artists, and authors to discuss the many ways in which they engage in cultural politics.
So, what is cultural politics? Cultural politics examines how power, identity, and social struggles are negotiated through cultural expressions, including art, media, language, and everyday practices.
Cultural politics explores how representation shapes social realities, how dominant ideologies maintain hegemony, and how marginalized communities resist through alternative narratives and artistic forms.
Cultural politics intersects with race, class, gender, and sexuality. It reveals how cultural production both upholds and challenges systems of oppression. It also considers the role of aesthetics and political practices in shaping social movement and how globalization and transnationalism influence cultural exchanges and diasporic identities.
So in this episode in particular, we're going to be providing you with a brief overview of a new book, Nuyorican and Diasporic Visual Arts. That's the text, that's the focal point of our conversation today. And we're also going to give you a brief bios on our 2 guests, Arlene Davila and Jasmine Ramirez.
Then we will move into the interview segment, which was recorded via Zoom on Friday, February 28th, 2025. Finally, Rebecca and I will return together at the end of the episode to share our reflections on the conversation with Arlene and Jasmine.
So before we start, we wanted to provide a bit of background on the book that Arlene and Jasmine will be talking about with us today, Nuyorican and Diasporic Visual Art. So to do that, I'm going to start out by sharing the blurb from the Duke University Press website. They write, although Puerto Rican artists have always been central figures in contemporary American and international art worlds, they have largely gone unrecognized and been excluded from art history canons. Nuyorican and Diasporic Visual Art provides a critical survey of Puerto Rican art production in the United States from the 1960s to the present. The contributors assert the importance and contemporaneity of the Nuyorican art movement by tracing its emergence alongside other American vanguardist movements, highlighting its innovations and exploring it as an expression of Puerto Rican culture beyond New York to include cities such as Chicago, Philadelphia, and Orlando. They also foreground the contributions and radical aesthetics of female, Black, and queer Puerto Rican artists. Following the expansion and decentralization of the Puerto Rican diaspora and its artistic output, this volume is a call to action for scholars, curators, and artists to address the historical inequalities that have marginalized diasporic artists and reassess the presence of Puerto Rican artists.
It is also important to give credit where credit is due. The editors whom we are speaking with today are crucial in making sure a project like this comes to fruition, but the project wouldn't exist without the research and contributions of the different authors who have contributed essays to this volume. Let's take a moment to acknowledge them. We have Joseph Anthony Cassidy, who was a guest on our podcast back in Season 4, Taina Caragol, Arnaldo Cruz Malavé, Deborah Cullen Morales, Arlene Davila, Kerry Doran, Elizabeth Ferrer, Jomaira Figueroa Vasquez, Al Hoyos Tomi, Teres Lacovino, Johnny Irizarry, Joana Londoño, Ura Joan Noel, Nestor David Pastor, Jasmine Ramirez, Melissa Ramos Borges, Raquel Reychard, Abdiel Segarra Ríos, Wilson Valentín Escobar, y yo también yo también escribí en el libro Rojo Robles. Yeah, reviews of the book by scholars and authors has been generally positive. Aset Morales, author of Fantasy Island, Colonialism, Exploitation, and the Betrayal of Puerto Rico, states, Nuyorican and diasporic visual art is, and I quote, an indispensable volume. And he goes on to say, the art of all marginalized people is inherently political. And this cogent and impactful essay by an array of quintessential contributors are a loving tribute to Puerto Rico's rapidly expanding diasporic arts community. And according to Adriana Zavala, author of Becoming Modern, Becoming Tradition, this unique and much needed book challenges the elitism and racism that continues to characterize the art world.
Yeah, the book is available now through the Duke University Press website, and we'll be sure to link it along with the episode in which we spoke to Joseph about Lois Griffith, the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, and the importance of archives in our show notes.
Finally, let's introduce our guest for today. Arlene Davila is an anthropology and American studies professor at New York University, NYU. Her research focuses on cultural equity, Latinx, and critical race studies. She's the author of numerous books and articles, including Latinx Art, Artists, Markets, and Politics, published in 2020, which was selected as one of the best art books that year by the New York Times. She's the founding director of the Latinx Project, an interdisciplinary center focusing on Latinx art and culture. Jasmine Ramirez is an adjunct professor of art at the City College of New York and an independent curator who has collaborated with the Bronx Museum and Museo del Barrio and Taller Boricua, among other spaces. She is known for her extensive work in the arts, beginning with her academic memorialization of Nuyorican cultural contributions. She has been curating exhibits that explore the intersection of cultural identity, race, gender, and social justice since 1999. Her most recent exhibition was Pasado y Presente, Art After the Young Lords, 1969 to 2019, and she has published numerous essays and critical pieces addressing the complexities of navigating cultural spaces.
And with that, let's move on to the interview.
Bienvenidas, Arlene. Bienvenida, Jasmine. Welcome to Latinx Vision podcast. How are you today?
Great. Thank you for having us.
Well, let's dive right in with our questions. So we're here today to talk about Nuyorican and diasporic visual art, and that was the title that you gave to the anthology that was just released. So let's start by discussing these two identity terms and why you chose to distinguish between them. What communities, geographic, cultural, etc., are included when you use these terms?
What I can say is this, Nuyorican is the term Nuyorican, meaning New York Rican, is the first of a number of diasporic terms. So Puerto Ricans in New York began calling themselves Nuyorican to distinguish themselves from the culture of the island. And that started a whole bunch of different names. And actually that term was applied from the island to us. We would be called Neo-Ricans or Nuyorican, and it was the poets who decided to kind of take a term that meant we were somehow apart from the island, but in a disparaging way, into one of honor, to carry both cultures and to remake Puerto Rico here in New York. But actually, this remaking and rethinking of one's relationship to the home country is it's prevalent among many other ethnic groups. And when Puerto Ricans moved to Chicago or to Philadelphia, they began to call themselves Philly Ricans or Flory Ricans. So it seems like a constant reinvention of oneself in relationship to the United States, but still keeping that Rican sense to the island. So it's a way of distinguishing, but yet maintaining some sort of tie to our culture of origin.
Thank you, Jasmine. I guess we also wanted to add to the diasporic component of the title, right? And it was a way of, there's a popular usage that, oh, they're New Yorican for anybody who's in the United States, whether they're actually living in Kansas, right? So by anchoring diasporiqueño as a category, we wanted to encompass the reality that the New Yorican category, as used to embody everyone from the United States, reproduces a geographical determinism that prioritizes New York, right? And we wanted to break from that to really anchor the geographic diversity of the populations, of Puerto Rican populations throughout the United States, right? For sure. And then added to that, we also wanted to counter the geographical determinism that characterizes a lot of the art historical research that tends to favor national identifications over diasporican or over diaspora, right? So you have global categories of nationality. Elsewhere I've spoken about Latin American art being more recognized than Latinx art, which is a diaspora category. So we wanted to center, right, the diaspora, which is not a nationalist-based space, as a space of analysis for our book. So both categories do the same work, right, which is trouble the geographical categories that are dominant in our history.
We also cannot ignore the fact that the poets actually were the first ones to come up with this whole notion of diasporican, right? With that poem by Mariposa, Ode to a Diasporican. So the poets themselves were part of the New Yorican movement as they began to just speak for a more global condition of Puerto Ricans as they themselves are becoming more global. They made up a new term. And I think these terms will just continue. Part of our identity, I think, is constant reinventing ourselves according to the circumstances and the geographical spaces that we're facing.
I'm going to add to that, and I'm sorry, Rojo, that you haven't answered any questions yet, but Jasmine and I haven't had a chance to talk about the book elsewhere, so thank you for the opportunity. But I wanted to add that Jasmine's point is one that the book, I think, makes very clearly, which is the importance of poetry and spoken word in the New Yorican art movement, right? And you see that relationship, the New Yorican space in downtown as a space where so many visual artists collaborated and worked with as a hub, as an arts hub, right? One of the things we wanted to do in this volume was anchor the visual arts, because in New Yorican art history or in New Yorican art, we have not a lot, because we always need more work around New Yorican literature and more work around New Yorican poetry, but people are more familiar, right, with spoken word than they are with the visual arts, right? Which is another way that our book is contributing to the conversation.
Talking about orality, this book started as a conference in 2022. Can you describe the journey of this project from the conference, the virtual conference that we had in 2022 to the final published version that was just released in 2025?
Absolutely. Rojo, you were one of the contributors to the conference, right?
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Yeah, and it was a great conference, I have to say. Really, I learned a lot from all the participants, and it's right now it is a pleasure to read their final product. But maybe the audience would like to learn more about that process.
Yeah, absolutely. This started in 2022 when we made a call to do a conference. We dreamed that maybe it could be something else, but we didn't imagine that it would be a book, in fact. But we knew we wanted to have a record in our archives in the topic of New Yorican art, and we made an open call. We did an open call particularly because we didn't think that there was that many people out there doing this research. In fact, in interventions, we have difficulty finding contributors that write about New Yorican and diasporican artists. We know in the literature, the only real scholarly work that existed was Jasmine Ramirez's dissertation that was published in 2005, right? So we knew there was a gap in the literature. So we're like, let's do this call and let's see who comes up. And it was so fruitful to see the results of the call. That's how we met young people like yourself, Rojo, or Joseph Cáceres. It was a great learning experience to see that, well, maybe art historians are not writing on the Yorican diasporican art, but look at all the people working in interdisciplinary spaces that are writing in literature and performance art that are in fact and can contribute. So that conference, what we did is we invited, and most of the people that participated in the conference actually became contributors to the book. Some people couldn't make it, but others did, which we then complemented with selected invitations. For instance, Taina Caracol, Deb Cooling. Deb Cooling was actually, Jasmine, if you want to talk about that, right? We identified particularly gaps that we felt needed to be strengthened, right, by special calls. And Jasmine, maybe you could talk about, some of the outreach we did to complement what we found through the call.
Well, certainly one of the most important things that I wanted discussed was the relationship between the artists at Tayel and other Nuyorican artists with African Americans. And one of the sites where there was a lot of interaction was at the Bob Blackburn printmaking workshop. And so Deborah Cullen used to work there. And in fact, knew Diogenes and Nitza Tufino and Juan Sanchez prior to being hired as a curator at El Museo. So I asked her to contribute an essay about Bob Blackburn's relationship as a mentor to Nuyorican artists. So that's something that I was I thought it was really important to do, because sadly, African American and Latinx art histories are often separated. They're treated as two distinct tracks in art history. And that isn't how it happened in real life. And I wanted our scholarship not to reproduce, to break these patterns of segregation that exist in the United States and in academia especially.
Speaking of that sort of interrelationship between art and academia, the book launch happened alongside the exhibition Rican Visions, which was part of the Latinx project at NYU. Can you tell us about that interrelationship between the book and the art exhibit, or even just the Latinx project at large?
Yeah, I guess I'll take that, but briefly to acknowledge that the exhibition came in conversation. Like Yasmin was part of the early conversations about what would it look like, and we had a debate about, what is the relationship, because we couldn't imagine reproducing the book into an exhibition, right? That will take a lot of work and the more in-depth historical analysis. And we realized, what we really should be doing is do something in conversation, but not at all related to the book, that in fact expanded, and that's exactly what we did. You will see that the book is more historical because of the fact that a lot of the contributors went that route, and we felt, well, why don't we do something with more emerging artists? At the Latinx Project, we have an annual call where people can apply for our Artist in Residence open call, and we had a lot of files, hundreds of files every year, but we had very robust archive of diasporican artists who had been applying year after year. So we went to those and we selected more than half of the exhibiting artists in the show actually come from the call, but are artists that are not mentioned in the book, along with artists that we reach out to because they're legacy veteran artists that should have been included in the book, but nobody's writing about them. We're so proud to have Evelyn Lopez de Guzman, for instance, who's in her 70s, an abstract artist that nobody really knows much about, or that we also included Jorge Luis Rodriguez or Marina Gutierrez. So it was great to have this more legacy artists along with emerging artists, and that conversation to basically anchor the same point that the book does, right? Is that you look at them and you realize, wow, there's a lot going on here and there's a lot more work to do. And that, I think, is the message that both the exhibition and the book make very clear, right? So thank you. The other thing that we're very proud to also is that the exhibition was curated by two diasporican curators, right? And I want to shout out Andrea Figueroa, who's from Florida-based, but diasporican-based in New York, and Ailda Figueroa, who did her art history degree at the University of Puerto Rico and worked with us at the Latinx Project, and our team member, Javier Robles Armas, whose expertise is Latinx art. So it's great to have been able to produce a an exhibition that also anchor the voices of new curators that are gaining expertise in diasporic art, which is so necessary.
Yeah, indeed. Please visit the exhibition. It's at the Latinx Project at NYU. It's a really fantastic work. And as you said, it's really great to see it and read it right alongside the book. Yeah, one thing that I was like really pleased about the book launch, it was precisely the presence of the artists, right? And how the artists were like involved, right? Participating of the launch. They were like really proud, of the work, and they saw themselves in the conversation. And that is something that the book does really well, is presenting the interrelationships between the scholars and the artists. And I wanted you to talk about that. In a specific, I was thinking, for example, how you describe Joseph Casares' chapter in the introduction, in a specific, how you talk about how he highlight oral alternative histories. And I feel that definitely that's there in Joseph's chapter, but it's something that is part of the praxis of the book. Yeah. So within and beyond this particular chapter on New Yorican and Caribbean surrealism, what has been the role of people, memories, stories, and archives as presented in the anthology?
Okay, I'm just going to mention a couple of things quickly in relation to that. Number one is that we have to acknowledge that art history as an academic discipline, there's very few of us who are of Puerto Rican descent that are in this discipline. And that within this discipline, Latin American art is privileged over studies of specifically of Puerto Rican art. Mm-hmm. So many of our scholars, in fact, are encouraged to get their PhD in a Latin American subject, which is, considered more, you have a lot more people in the field who are quote unquote experts in Latin American art, and it has a much longer and more historically validated artists and academics. So we're not really encouraged in art history to do this work because you keep reproducing the same thing. Well, there's no books, there's no experts. I was able to break that in some ways because I grew up in the movement. So one of my first mentors in the art world was Gino Rodriguez at the Alternative Museum. And I actually, as a scholar, as a young person, I was a young person. I had no idea that I was really going to get a PhD at that time when I was 17 and started working with Gino. But through Gino and through many other, Tayel, to El Museo, I've worked at all of these spaces as many of our contributors have worked, as Ura Johan Noel is a practicing poet and has worked in the New Yorican Poets Cafe and wrote his dissertation on that, wrote one of his first books on that. So I think this is something that is, as scholars, because we're often the first ones working in these spaces to hear the stories, and we write them down. And so we get the primary source from the artists, and we write it down. So we're sort of the first people to kind of write down the stories that we're hearing about. Also, even in Puerto Rico, a lot of the artists have been their own historians. Mm-hmm. They do that double duty. Diogenes Ballester, for example, very, very important artist who did the first chronology of Tayel Boricua for I think it was their 20th or 30th anniversary. So because there's been very few of us who have been academics, it's been the artists who have often been their own historians. So there's a lot of responsibility. They've been the institution builders, the primary historians and curators of a lot of work that's gone on in New York. And so the idea of the curator and the art historian, that comes more in the 80s, in like the 90s in New York, 20 years after the field has been broken.
I want to add to that the lack of archives in libraries too. Which is a big gap. At NYU, for instance, is a good example because the Great Art Museum, for instance, and there's the downtown archives that do not include material on Loisaida and the Lower East Side New Yorican movement. In fact, some of our contributors, like Alto Tomei, talking about Maria Dominguez, a lot of the work and material on first person goes directly from Maria Dominguez, Yet one of the things that we discuss is the lack of archives on downtown when the downtown art scene is so recognized by so many museums and even NYU, right? So the lack of archives makes interview-based work and oral history work more important than ever in our communities. And you'll see that reflected in a lot of the interviews. And one of the things that I think that message that should convey to people listening is the importance of interdisciplinarity again, because Jasmine, correct me here, but traditional art history analysis looks down upon you talking to artists, right? Whereas disciplines like ethnography, anthropology, sociology, cultural studies more broadly, you cannot imagine writing about visual arts if you also don't talk about the artist, right? So you see that for communities like ours that do not have archives, if you do not go directly to the artists, you really wouldn't have you'll have very little to write about, because those materials and their papers or the work are not collected anywhere.
And they're also not reviewed. I mean, a lot of the work that was going on in the 70s and 80s was not reviewed in the papers of record. Maybe one or two articles, but we really rely for our history on those organizations and on their records and on oral history and memory and the posters. One of the most important things that we have that is really more at the centro than anywhere, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, are the Puerto Rican posters made by those artists for so many cultural organizations that sometimes the only way we know that this organization existed was that there is a poster that gives the name, date, and what was happening at that time. So artists have been so important to our visual culture and the recording of history. They really have been our historians.
Yeah. And you talked about this sort of invisibility in the introduction to the book too, right? That this structure, this interdisciplinary structure of the alternative spaces, Puerto Rican alternative spaces, may have also contributed to that invisibility in the New York art world. I was wondering if you could speak a little more on that, and maybe what suggestions do you have about making Nuyorican and diasporican art more visible?
Well, I mean, we're doing it by writing about it, but what I can just tell you as a historian, right, or what I've talked about, because I know the other historians who have done, like Julie Alt, for example. She did the first sort of alternative history book, Alternative New York, and several, like the Nuyorican Pope, the places in Loisaida in particular, the Nuyorican Poets Cafe and the New Rican Village and Charas el Bohio, which was actually gigantic, right? It's bigger than PS1. It was in an old school building, and it housed so many different organizations. But they kind of didn't understand the relationship that they had to artists necessarily. They didn't understand it as an alternative space because it says Nuyorican Poets Cafe. Well, unless you know the space and you know the artists and the scene that's going there, a historian outside would ignore it because they wouldn't necessarily see it as part of the alternative art history that they're writing about. They think it wants literature, and I'm not focusing on that. So it's really more that there's a lot of different names, and it kind of confuses non-Latino practitioners who have written this history thus far. So I think that's why I've become really important, because I knew that these things were going on, and it was a matter of proving, Nuyorican Poets Cafe was also an important place for theater and performance art, and a place where artists went and actually drew and had exhibitions there. And it counts as a visual art space, even though the title would lead you to think otherwise.
And also the idea of how do we imagine and become attentive to art spaces or art making practices that take place off the grid of what we recognize as an art space, right?
Exactly.
And that becomes also a grassroots organizations that are community-based or not seen as arts, but have arts programs. And even the street, like one of the things that really comes up is the importance of writing, graffiti, street art. And that happens basically, in subways or in the streets, in murals. And So we have to kind of open up our blinders, right? That tends to prioritize art making practices that take place in more recognized, right, spaces such as museums or galleries. That's not going to work for our community. Because our community has been making art making practices. And in fact, as Yasmin's essay beautifully shows, we've been creating new spaces, right? Not waiting to be recognized by those, but creating many multidisciplinary spaces. So it requires really getting rid of our disciplinary boundaries of what art is and where you find it.
Yeah, and sort of adding to what Arlene said, our vanguardism, the audience was always the surrounding community. It wasn't necessary. Our spaces privilege responding to the immediate community in which they were situated. They're almost like site-specific spaces. You can think of them as site-specific creations. And so the audience and what's going on there really had to respond to the conditions that the people who are also attending the audience is facing. That relationship to community is very, very important. Less so in, let's say, artist space. Okay, their community are people who describe themselves as visual artists. So already right there's a lot of people that are not necessarily part of the target audience. Our target audience was our working class community and other artists, but that's the privileged category. So yeah, you can't just be so univision there. You've got to have a lot of flexibility in what you're exhibiting.
Jasmine, I really like that you connect precisely that dynamic of invisibility, but also of the audience that is looking and supporting its own community of artists through the figure of the cimarrón, right? The maroons, right? And you bring a quote by Marta Moreno that says that during the late 60s and early 70s, Puerto Ricans in New York precisely did what cimarrones, the maroons, did during colonization, that is creating their own political palenques or self-sufficient spaces. Can you expand on that comparison? I feel like that comparison is really important to think about Marronage from this particular history, from the point of view of this particular history.
I am not as knowledgeable about that history of cimarrones that Marta Moreno Vega talks about. Obviously, I know a little bit of it, but what I can say is that on the one hand, we created these spaces that were for community empowerment and learning. On the one hand, we did that. But we did it within a much broader context of the alternative art movement. And one of the ways in which I think my scholarship changes the direction that many art historians have taken in the past, which is to focus on the Puerto Rican community by itself, or maybe relate it to what's going on the island, is that I really try to relate it to a broader movement that's going on in New York. And claim that on the one hand, we have these self-sufficient spaces, but we are also, we're not hiding. We're demanding, and we're making space within the public sphere for our culture to be recognized alongside French and, Dutch and all the other nationalities and peoples that have also had impact on the visual culture of New York City. So I'm saying that we're not hiding. We had to create these spaces, and then we came out fighting and saying this work is valid, and in fact is avant-garde, because this whole idea of social practice art, all of that comes from Puerto Rican, really from Latinx and Black artists who are doing this service for the community. And after a while, this idea of serving the community, becomes its own sort of genre within the arts. Of course, after white people decide to do it, but our community really begins this so-called social practice art out of necessity and takes it on and refines it. So, for example, Pepón Osorio, one of the mainstay, one of the linchpins of social practice art, is Puertorriqueño. Okay, and he won the MacArthur. And he won the MacArthur while he's working in the South Bronx, while he's working within the community. So there's a time in which we have to be self-sufficient, but we are not hiding in the shadows. We're watching them when we're going to come out. And we're,
I love
I want to add to that. I love that. Thank you, Jasmine. One of the essays in our collection highlights the work of Nilda Peraza and the story of Mocha. And I think it ties directly to what Jasmine is saying, because if you know the history of the Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art, which was very short-lived, but, this was located in Soho, right? Like mainly in the middle of what was then the upcoming area of contemporary art and vanguard art. And Nilda Pera was creating a vanguardist institution of then Hispanic, what we would now say Latinx, Latino, Latina. The Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art was presenting Chicanx art and work by basically Latin American artists living in the United States broadly, engagingly, and very powerfully right in Broadway, right in front of the new museum. That's where the new museum was, just across the street from Mocha. And I think if you, in the interview on that piece by David Nestor Pastor, what you really realize is Nilda's vision of, we're not hiding anywhere. We're going to be here. We're not in our ghettos, because that's where the tendency to sort of like imagine that our institutions had to be in East Harlem or Lower East Side or the Bronx. She daringly resisted that. And, she ultimately, her vision was not successful. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Right? The idea that, there should just be one institution, or Museo del Barrio. Why do we need that? There was a lot of other issues that, that you could talk about that. But that is a part of what Jasmine is highlighting, the fact that so many of our, and the Alternative Museum, right? There's so many institutions that were really at the vanguard, but also very resistant to the idea that we couldn't be at the forefront and recognized at the forefront of contemporary art.
And I think that's something that my work and a lot of the other work is doing is, so for example, people understood exit art, right? But since it didn't have a Latino name, they'd have to know that Papo was Nuyorican. So I just basically said there's a lot of spaces. The way that I got around a lot of this issue is calling it Puerto Rican alternative art spaces. And in that way, I was able to bring in a bunch of disparate organizations that were, what made them the same was that they wanted to be alternative. Sometimes they wanted to be alternative to Tayel and El Museo. Some of them wanted to be an alternative to the Met and MoMA. They each had their own vision of how they were alternative, but they were all kind of founded by different Puerto Rican artists with different agendas who worked in concert. I think the great thing about our movement versus like the surrealist movement, when people, artists would like get mad at each other and they would be excommunicated and all of that, is that as much as we squabble about things, these artists come together and have been working together since 1969, many of them. They have a long history of grudges, pero cuando se tiene que hacer el trabajo para la comunidad, they're going to do it. And they're going to do it with pride and love, like we do. Arlene and I had many fights, but we come out together strong on this book. Fights about the content, fights about all kinds of crap. But we are stronger friends than ever today. Right, Arlene?
Absolutely.
You're talking about the avant-garde a bit, Jasmine, but the history of avant-garde movements is so often told from a Eurocentric perspective, right? So I'd love it if you could maybe both speak to this idea of how the book challenges those lenses and opens new paths to understanding the input of other communities into these histories.
Okay, I'm just going to be very brief again, and then I'm going to let Arlene take it over. In art history, generally speaking, in every book I read, practically of let's say, institution building in New York, it's actually the same people acting, but they're named Rockefeller. So they, they have the money to kind of, put into execution what they want to see. They have money, they have the archives, they have, they are able to build these institutions, and it's kind of much easier to document that because there's just so much. In our case, it's also a bunch of people who are getting together to create a collectivity or an organization. But because we don't have those archives, it's only through oral history that we have a way of validating and documenting that. they're having cocktail parties and we're having street parties. And our artists, for example, often did not have galleries. So we have to go into the artist archive and photograph these things ourselves. And in art history, there's another value system that's going around, which is that if you didn't get a gallery, then you must not be a successful artist. And this movement really challenges this idea that validation comes from the marketplace. So we're the vanguard of the people. Okay, this movement was a vanguard of the people. It was not the vanguard of the upper class. Still valid. It's unusual because working class people, and what we have been told is that we want to, success is leaving the barrio. But all of these artists, in fact, flipped that. Mm-hmm. They were out of el barrio. They were at SVA, and they said, no, we want to create in el barrio. So what is avant-garde is very situational. Okay, there's no one thing that can make something avant-garde. I think you have to look at each case and say to yourself, was that forward thinking? Did that bring new ideas to the table? And I think that movement really changed New York City in so many ways, in terms of production, in terms of visual culture, in terms of bringing new audiences, in terms of insisting that organizations have things, have bilingual signage. Yeah, forward. We have been forward.
I think that was beautifully said, and Jasmine, and that's why I think your essay in the volume is like a must read for everyone. Anyone who reads the book should start with Jasmine's essay. I just want to add that a key element is we have to just call it what it is: the racism of the academic and art history canon and establishment that makes it impossible for the work and this movement to be evaluated and be regarded and be valued, right? Which goes back to where do you see these scholars writing about Nuyorican art, right? In music, where do you see the curators, or that's been such a void, right, of the critical thinkers in institutions within the canon have been non-existent. This work has been done by community organizations, and I want to shout out the work that now the Centro de Puerto Rican Studies is doing. Now the Museum of Contemporary Art in Puerto Rico is beginning to finally collect more diasporican artists, right? So we need that, right? There's been this gap, right, between the work that's been done within communities and community organizations and the lack of institutional spaces in whether it be universities and museums that are collecting and that are actually archiving this work or hiring experts or people with expertise in diasporican art. And I think we really need that, because unless you have that, right, you're going to have these white-centric and Eurocentric definitions of the canon and the vanguard, because the collections and the foundational, right, the foundations that make up that canon are not complete. We have a lot of work to do. So basically, we're hoping this book will be a start of the conversation.
Right.
And people know, oh my God, this is something that's missing, right? And I think that's one of the things that the book it was intended to do, is to call attention to an absence. Following Adriana Zavala's work in the U.S. Latinx Forum, right? The important work of the Latinx Art Forum of naming, right? This is an absence. And what the Nuyorican Diasporican book does is it calls attention to an absence so that we could begin to feel it, because otherwise any canon or any art history is going to be incomplete.
Talking about an absence, you open a path in the book to considering poetry written on walls, graffiti, scenes, and handmade books as part of the visual arts, of the Nuyorican and diasporican visual arts, but New York arts as well. Can you elaborate on this emphasis about writing as art?
I mean, the first graffiti art impresario is Puerto Riqueño. So I think that we've always seen our murals. In Puerto Rico, artists making books was a fundamental part of the practice. You learn how to design books as part of your artistic practice in New York, and especially like illustrating poetry. Look, there is a hierarchy in I think, in the arts in Puerto Rico. I think the highest is music, then literature, then the visual arts. I mean, it's always been music and literature have been pretty much promoted as essential arts in Puerto Rico. And artists have in many ways been a little bit of like a support system, often like that illustrated Plena, for example, in the creation of books and posters really about poets and musicians.
Yeah, I wanna bring it to, I think, Ura Joan Noel's essay. I think I wish he were here because he could better bring this attention that I actually thought it was very intriguing when we got that essay. It's like, oh my God, look at that, book cards as art, right? And how do we begin to sort of appreciate the fact that, is particularly with the New Yorican poetry movement that has gotten more attention from many scholars, right? We have never looked at the visual component of poetry making, right? And the visual element of poetry too, right? So I think that was a very beautiful element that I think Ura's essay is pointing us to look at, particularly also by appreciating many poets that are also visual artists, right? That we did not consider. So I think that there's, the conversation around writing is not only limited to that we recognize around the work of Lee Quiñones, por ejemplo, or the graffiti artist, but also the fact that, wow, there's a visuality around poetry that we should also look at all this production of poetry books and scenes, right? That, and again, this is, I couldn't, this is not an area of expertise that I've done.
I mean, in art history, we do have that. It's not uncommon, right? The surrealists made many books. So this is the idea of a book as art is not uncommon. But I do think that it's good that Ura Joan threw it out again. I also think that it's more, it's just as important for literature people to be aware of this as visual art historians. And someone like Pedro Pietri really, transcends this category of poet because he was also a conceptual artist,
and a performance artist.
And so there's a lot of genres that these artists, cross throughout their lives. And remember, these artists continue to evolve. So, the Pedro Pietri who recited Puerto Rican obituary 20 years later is doing conceptual things on the street. That's an evolving person. He wasn't doing that necessarily before. So we just have to also be not pigeonhole artists. Not pigeonhole ourselves, not pigeonhole this movement, but really, really look carefully at what artists are doing. And I think as long as you're true to the artist and you try to remain true to the facts, it'll get complicated, but it'll be authentic and it'll make change.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I really liked in the book that, as you addressed in the introduction, was that, there was this attempt to kind of fill some of the gaps that have existed. But you also were kind of challenging yourselves and the readers to see if there was like more, what more? Not that is there more, because there definitely is, but like, I'm curious, what gaps did you see that you would specifically like to see investigated going forward? And how can the scholarly and activist communities that you've been talking about come together to address these gaps?
I mean, women artists, let's start there, right? Like women artists, punto. So many veterans that we recognize, where are the women artists? Contemporary artists, to me was incredible. And this actually, the call was the way the exercise, the call became like a survey of basically what it is that we're getting or not getting, right? So contemporary artists, it goes back to the disciplinary things, right? Art history brings you to the past, to history. So, so we have like more on the 70s and, the past, but then there's really no continuity on the present. There's huge gaps about the geography. There's a tendency, New York City continues to be the center and the most documented art center, but we had really difficulty finding contributors that are really highlighting the artistic communities anywhere else. In fact, we had to reach out, and Raquel Reichard from Orlando, in Philadelphia, we invited Johnny Irizarry. Many of the diasporican contributors were contributors that we really reached out to because the initial call was very New York centered, right? So I think that we really need to do some work to begin to document, to get out of the New York City coast and really get to so many other art communities. We also need more people to write about living artists today. And when we talk about the huge gap, I mean, I would love to say that, we have a lot of work on Juan Sanchez. No, we don't. The fact is that our veterans are also not well documented, although Juan Sanchez is actually the subject of some forthcoming monographs now. That's great. But when you look at our veterans at large, I'm hopeful for Yasmin, you're going to write about Fernando Salicrup for interventions, we hope.
Oh, yes, that's true. Yeah, definitely.
Because he's the cover of our book, and you find zero published about Fernando Salicrup, right? So the gaps are so huge and so embarrassing that what we really hope is that the book begins to be kind of like a kick in the butt for everyone there, grad students who are looking for topics. There's really an excess, and then of course within the visual arts, there's mediums, we can talk about that, or also what else, larger conversations about visual art, because our book in our initial call was hoping to be broader, right? And, we made a call for fashion and for other types of visual art, right? And we didn't actually get that at all, right? We have a contribution from Joana Londoño, who talks about casitas and design and architecture, which we're excited about because at least it makes a nod, right, to the importance of not just looking at, the visual arts as the way we think about in terms, painting, sculpture, or whatever, but also to think about, design, right?
Talking about contemporary artists, what is standing out these days for you from the New Rican, from the diasporican artists, alive, working, presenting in different gallery spaces, alternative spaces, museums, perhaps? Yeah, what things will you highlight from the current production of Puerto Ricans in the United States?
I'll start there because, I wrote a conclusion to kind of talk about some of the artists that I'm very excited about. And the real trend that was very evident by looking at artists is the emphasis, Puerto Rico, the diasporican community has been displaced, right? Over and over and over, right? You cannot think about Puerto Ricans without thinking about the history of displacement and gentrification and being kicked out, both from the island, from our communities. So the spatial politics, right, of the diasporican community being so central to a lot of the work that is historical, but also contemporary. So in the introduction, I look at the work of Lee Quiñones, which is a graffiti artist, and the incredible spatial politics that stamping graffiti onto space and placemaking, right, of taking space in communities, to the work of Chelin Rodriguez, right, who is basically creating archives of the Bronx and urban historical archives of community making. People like Daniel de Jesus, that is also doing similar things in Bushwick by actually portraying a changing community. To Rigoberto Torres, who is doing something similar about cherishing the local. It's like creating archives through the sculptures of community residents, saying these people live here, they're alive. And that work becomes a real, very powerful anti-displacement, anchoring identity onto space that I think so many Puerto Rican artists is kind of an ongoing constant. And I would argue that, you would see similar practices across diasporican communities, particularly given all of the incredible pressures on the island too, right? And on the archipelago too, right? That people are being forced also to migrate. So that's my 2 cents. But I also love so much art and so many diasporican artists that I'm so excited about basically a lot of what I see. And I would love to hear, Yasmin, about any trends or.
I'm going to stay away from that, but I am going to talk about a space, the space that I have besides the Latinx Project is Clemente Soto Vélez, and how it's really the last of the quote unquote Nuyorican alternative art spaces that opened. It was founded by, and it's named after a Puerto Rican poet, right? And the work that they're doing there right now, the building is undergoing a renovation to make it compliant with people with disabilities. They're getting an elevator and other upgrades to the building. But that space, I think, is a beacon that we can sort of still have an alternative space in New York that's serving the surrounding community. They focus on Puerto Rican art. It has a theater. They have La Latea. There's something about it. It's a very grassroots organization. It still has that kind of gritty sense of can-do spirit from the Nuyorican movement, run by a new generation of directors and curators, including Libertad Guerra, who's from the island but has lived here and really regards herself as a Nuyorican, and Moncho Lopez, her husband, who is now curator at the Museum of the City of New York, and has been very instrumental in really giving artists in El Barrio their due. Like, they just had a whole year of an artist residency with Manny Vega, for example. And that's been wonderful. I'm very excited about the work.
I'm also I wanna also highlight Centro, particularly Centro, because Centro is probably one of our legacy institutions, but for many, many years stayed away from arts, right? Jasmine and I have conversations about that.
Well, and I didn't stay away from art, but
it didn't invested the level that we're seeing now. I really want to shout out Jomaira Figueroa.
Yes, absolutely.
The way in which
and Angel.
They have a new series called Diasporic Art in Motion that has been really, really important in highlighting. I think they do every week or every other week. They have like highlighting diasporican artists, and it's very open because artists can apply and self-designate, hey, I'm also a diasporican artist, and you get to be shout out. And also highlight the upcoming exhibition that opens up in March 21st. It's called Diasporican Collage. And it's one of the exhibitions, by the way. She's also one of the contributors. And her contribution is about Frank Espada. And the exhibition, Diasporican Collage, highlights also the work of Frank Espada. So I want to highlight that this is one of the exhibitions that is also in conversation with the book. She's one of our co-authors. And I think we need, this is incredible. I mean, that we have this I don't want to say embarrassment of richness, because we should have been at this level for a long time, and there's a lot more that needs to happen, right? But this year, we have, these three institutions that we've mentioned, have done really great work, and it would be great if other people look at the work that Centro is doing, look at the work at Clemente, and people begin to take lessons, because a lot more needs to happen, and this is just a start.
Yeah, that is great. The shout out to El Clemente and to Latea. And actually, we wanted to mention that our next episode is precisely on Latea and El Clemente as an art space. Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
We'll be interviewing Miguel Treyes for it, and we're actually going to be recording in the space. So
yeah, Miguel and I go back years, decades. In fact, I had to apologize to him that he came here in the 90s, and so his work falls outside of the date range that I have for the Nuyorican movement, right? Because it goes up to 89, and he came in the 90s. So I had to apologize that I really didn't mention his work. But he's another person who's done tremendous amount of work as a historian as well. He's not just a visual artist.
Mm-hmm.
He's correct.
He's curated in some important exhibitions of he's created many important exhibitions, but also of the Central posters. And you can read some of his writings about, that historicizes and looks at and analyzes these posters. His sister is a very notable, amazing art historian on the island.
We're trying to connect the ELO of the season there, right?
Exactly. So you got it. Yeah. I'm glad we ended with Clemente as sort of an intro to your next one.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, we're very looking forward to that interview and to continue this conversation in the next episode as well. Yeah.
Thank you both for joining us for this. Where can people get the book? Where can they find it? And are there any events that you have to announce around the book? Come out to our
spring party fundraiser. We do it every year, and we need all the support. Our programs are sustained by basically contributions.
That's the Latinx project.
This is the Latinx project. It's April 2nd. There are tickets available for as little as $75 while they last. And I couldn't say more. It's really a special celebration. I'm so proud of the kind of community that we've built. So this is a moment when we need community, come out, dance with us, and support us. And also, the party is accompanied by an auction where you could buy the work of Latinx artists. So important that we are contributing, that we are supporting our artists. The auction goes directly to them and us. We actually don't make money out of the auction. It's more of a advertisement of the fact that we need to create markets for our artists, because the distribution, our artists get as much as 50 to 100% of the sale goes to them. So this is a great time for people to share it in the network so that we can create more of a sustainable community by supporting our artists and buying their work.
And our artist talk?
Oh, yes. April 9th. April 9th, we have an artist talk with Adriana Zavala, Candida Alvarez, Yasmin Ramirez. We're going to have a tour of the exhibition also that day.
And David and Maria.
Yes. David Antonio Cruz y Maria Dominguez. Thank you, Jasmine. It will be great. It will be a great fun time because we'll also have a celebration and a reception.
Yeah, this is fantastic that all these events are coming up. And remember, you can get the book through Duke University Press, Nuyorican and Diasporic Visual Art.
And there is a 30% off code that you could get. I think it's listed in our webpage. It's listed. So if you don't find it, write to us. We'll give it to you. We want you to save money when you buy the book.
And you can also download the introduction for free. Mm-hmm. And if you go to I think most libraries now will have or soon will have an electronic version that you can sort of read online if you can't afford the book. So, we really want to make sure that people get this information, whichever way best suits them.
Great. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you.
So, Rojo, what did you think about our interview, our conversation with Jasmine and Arlene?
Yeah, I really appreciate the conversation, and I learned a lot from it. I have learned a lot from the project, from the contributors, and definitely from Arlene and Jasmine. And I appreciate how Jasmine and Arlene underscore in this particular interview the perspective of Nuyorican and diasporic artists as trailblazers who created interdisciplinary arts. They founded alternative spaces while documenting and creating testimonies of their practices. The way our Puerto Rican artists have engaged their immediate community is very commendable and very impactful for me. Since I write and research about cultural marronage, I love Jasmine's insight on how Nuyorican artists were not hiding, but holding ground, demanding visibility, and amplifying their voices and visions. And what about you, Rebecca? What do you appreciate from the conversation?
I really appreciated it as a way to highlight the work of Nuyorican and diasporic artists throughout the United States. I mean, I do wonder about expanding that term beyond the United States. I know it is a U.S. term, but when we're talking about the diaspora, we can always consider other angles as well. It's a term, but all these terms are always in evolution, and people and in debate as well, and in controversies as well, controversias as well. I also appreciated Arlene addressing what she saw as still missing from the conversation. And I was really grateful for the discussion around expanding how we define the arts, right? But kind of like what you mentioned, a key theme for me across the discussion was space. Jasmine addressed the issues around art history, prioritizing Latin American art over art created by those in the diaspora, whether we're talking Nuyorican and diasporic or other diasporic artists, right? So we're talking about that geographic space. And beyond that, the challenge to those who might be considering exploring diasporic visual arts to consider the geographic regions beyond New York, right? So that's kind of where it got me thinking, like, who gets to be included in these conversations of the diaspora, right? And how do we get those voices included? And I think they address that really nicely. It's not just about the geographic space, right? It's also, this is an artistic mediums. What artistic mediums get to be included? What generational affiliations get to be included? Like, who is part of certain movements and engaging in that part of the discussion, and how we can expand that, right?
Who are the people who get erased within the very limited documentation of the movement as well, right? That was a very important reflection as well.
Right. That some voices just get erased or maybe ignored or just go unseen because of what is prioritized in so many discussions. But I really, really like the conversation around the spaces of community and how they can be empowering for artists as well as other members of the community, right? Art is not just one thing. It's literature, it's visual, it's musical. Those are all things that were brought up. And alternative art spaces can be all encompassing. And I'm really excited that we kind of had that bridge in our conversation to our next episode, where we'll be talking with Miguel Treyes about Latea, actually in Latea.
So yeah, that's going to be exciting. Yes, how we can tie these two conversations together.
Right. Yeah. And it was not necessarily planned that way, but it just kind of worked out in that way. And just one more recap, I know they mentioned it in the interview, but anyone who's local to the New York area and is interested in learning more about the book, you can attend the upcoming panel co-hosted by the Latinx Project and El Centro. And as they mentioned, I think Arlene mentioned it, that's taking place on Wednesday, April 9th, 2025, from 6 to 8 p.m. And we'll put more information about that and a link in the show notes.
So my friends, amigos, amigas, thanks for joining us for this episode. You can contact us on social media or by email if you have anything to add to the conversation.
Yeah, follow the podcast on Instagram and Blue Sky at Latinx Visions. Our email address is latinxvisions@gmail.com. We'd love to include your thoughts in a future episode.
Listen to us wherever you get your podcasts, share us with your friends and families, subscribe and leave a 5-star review to help others find the show.
And stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll continue our conversation around Latinx cultural politics with Miguel Treyes from Teatro Latea in New York City.
Estamos a la escucha, mi gente.
Dale. Until next time.